Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us, as always. Now, conference championship weekend wrapped up, and it's now Sunday when we're recording this. We have the final CFP rankings. We're going to dive right into the rankings, the seeding, the matchups for this, the first 12-team playoff in the FBS football universe, which is fantastic. I am hyped up. Hopefully you are too. We'll get into that. Before we dive in, let me remind you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show. And you can always, send us your feedback. We love that. Take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. But let's dive into it. We want this to be kind of a quick reaction. The playoff rankings came out. There was a little bit of trepidation about who is going to get in and who's going to be left out after the upsets or just the surprise victories of the last weekend, specifically Clemson. That ended up being a wild game. Like, Clemson raced ahead. SMU managed to come back. And then was he a true freshman? 56-yarder. What a day for that guy. But of course, Clemson won. So the question was, would SMU drop far enough to box out Alabama, or with Alabama, some would argue based on brand name, but they also won a couple of ranked victories, with a 3-loss Alabama team still box out SMU. We had a bit of a preview with the AP, which had been fairly close when they came out a little bit earlier in the day. SMU had been ranked behind Alabama. Arizona State was, oddly enough, number 10. Alabama was 11, SMU 12, but Clemson was 13, which would have, of course, the fifth conference champion jumped up. But then we had, of course, by the way, I should note, there was a 1-point difference between Alabama and SMU in the AP poll. But here we are.
Oh, man.
Here we are. SMU has managed to push Alabama out of the playoff because Arizona State and Clemson had to move in. Now, Arizona State was a 12 seed. Clemson was a 16 seed. And we have our set. We have our matches set. What do you make of this before we can? I mean, that's just that drama. I mean, I will just say this for those who didn't watch. The seeding is now. Well, let me do the ranking. The ranking is Oregon, Georgia, Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Tennessee, Indiana, Boise State, SMU, Alabama, and Arizona State. But of course, the seeding's a little different. Your top 4 seeds. And one thing that was a benefit of Clemson winning is it eliminated what could have been a ferocious amount of arguments between the Big 12 and Boise State. The Big 12 absolutely thought they were going to lose one of those top 4 seeds to Boise State. Clemson rendered that moot. We have your top 4 seeds: Oregon, Georgia, Boise State. Still amazing that they're the 3rd seed now. And Arizona State are your top 4 seeds that are going to get first-round buys and just jump in the quarterfinal. And then we're going to get some very interesting matches. We're going to get the number 5 seed, Notre Dame, hosting number 8, Indiana. Number 6, Ohio State, hosting number 7, Tennessee. Actually, I should also mention, technically, I got the seeding a little bit off here. Number 5, Texas, hosting number 12, Clemson, and number 6, Penn State, hosting SMU. There's so much to set up there. It's all you, Sean. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, from my perspective, I felt like there was never real controversy between SMU and Alabama. It felt very manufactured. It felt very out of touch at times from people. It felt like what people expected. And look, I get it. At the same time, like, you are in a situation where last year an ACC team that was undefeated got left out for a 1-loss Alabama. So I understand why there was trepidation, but this was no conversation to me. When you looked at the rankings heading into the week, SMU was number 8 and Alabama was number 11. There was a pretty big gap between these teams. SMU loses on a 56-yard field goal at the buzzer in a conference championship game. I just did not think that it was realistic that SMU was going to be dropped 3 or 4 spots when they had been regarded so highly. Even with the loss, like, you're still in a situation where you're a 2-loss team to Alabama being a 3-loss team. And I know, like, one of the loudest people on this has been literal Nick Saban, who, of course, is now an analyst at ESPN. And he kept saying over and over again, we got to pay attention, strength of schedule. Like, how can we compare these teams that have different strength of schedules? Like, you should prioritize strength of schedule. What I want people to understand is, one, like, it is being taken under account. Alabama is a 3-loss team that was on the doorstep of the college football playoff against teams that went 11-1 in the regular season. Like, that is respect for strength of schedule. That's a ridiculous thing to even claim that it's not. When you look at the SEC versus every other conference, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that SEC teams this year, because of their strength of schedule, all got a mulligan. Like, essentially were treated like they had one less loss than they actually did compared to everybody else in college football. Alabama was being compared to 1 and 2 loss teams from the other conferences compared to being a 3-loss team. So, like, and even, by the way, you have Clemson win the ACC, they still rank behind all of the SEC 3-loss teams. So this narrative that people are trying to spread, that the SEC and strength of schedule are not being taken under consideration, is just garbage. That's just not the case. There are just enough teams that exceeded that, including SMU this year, that I don't think it should have been a conversation. So to me, there was never any controversy. It was something that we talked about because we had to talk about Alabama. But other than that, and other than I think that you look back, obviously I've had my disagreements with the 2014 result, the way that all worked out, and I disagreed vehemently with Florida State being left out for Alabama. But I do think that people, when you look at the body of work of the committee, like, they do a pretty good job. Like, it's pretty rare that we look up and they've done something that's just outrageous, that's wrong, that shouldn't be done. Like, you can also quibble with what they prioritize and what they value, but they tend to do it pretty consistently. I mean, we've talked about it. We have been able to almost exactly project which teams are going to be in the 12 all season long. Like, we have been on top. It is predictable to a certain extent. And so I think that from my perspective, I think that they got the bracket right, especially when you kind of factor in their sort of the way that they view the field. But I think that overall, like, these are the right teams. These are the 12 teams that should be in the college football playoff. I think that these are the 4 teams that deserve to have buys. I think, I thought that maybe Notre Dame would get a little more credit and be closer to 5 than they are to 7. But it's a relatively small gap between the 5 through 7 teams. I think that those 3 were a group. I think 8 and 9, when you look at Ohio State and Tennessee as seeds, like, I think that was kind of a group to its own. And I think that there was an Indiana versus SMU discussion. I thought that SMU might stay ahead of Indiana, but, again, it's probably a close discussion. So overall, I think that they got it pretty right. And I think that again, we have our full college football playoff brackets, and it's kind of what we expected.
Yeah, one thought I had, and I'd love to hear yours on this, is has to do with how these games ended really influenced this final seeding. I think Texas taking Georgia in overtime in their rematch game, and even though they lost, clearly, I mean, the CFP gave them even more benefit of the doubt than even the AP. They put them only down one spot to number 3, even though that was by far Texas's best performance against a ranked opponent, and of course they lost again. But I was surprised they kept them up as high as they did at 3, which of course, gave them the highest at large spot, the 5th seed, when perhaps Notre Dame might have argued to be a little bit higher, maybe I don't know if 6, but certainly they had an argument for being 5, as you noted. And then, really though, SMU going into the 4th quarter looked like their goose was cooked. It looked like they were getting blown out. And, they just weren't ready. They had a performance not as bad as Iowa State's complete implosion in the Big 12 conference title game. But, I mean, it just looked like, had the game ended with the score we went into the 4th quarter with, all right, SMU, you had your chance. You kind of threw up on yourself, and that's what everyone's going to remember going into today. But instead, they roared back tied the game. But I do wonder, had the game ended in that score, would SMU have ended up on the outside? What do you think?
I do. I do. I think that if they got destroyed, like I think that that's just a really bad look. You know, people think back to 2014, and actually, this is a little bit of an aside, but people talk about like, well, why did Melvin Gordon not have a better Heisman case? Why should we take Ashton Jinty seriously when we didn't take Melvin Gordon seriously? The answer is that it ended so badly that it kind of ruined everything about that 2014 Wisconsin season. They lost 59-0 in the conference title game. I can't remember who pointed this out to me. Was it you? I can't remember that Wisconsin was
They were
favored
favored.
heading into that
was our last
matchup.
episode. Yeah, they were actually favored by 4.
That's crazy. So they underperformed the line by 63 points, which is a crazy thing to say. And so, like, look, you have to leave the door open for if something like that happens, right? Like, when you are evaluating a team, you have to leave open the door to the idea that they play a team and don't look like they belong on the field. And SMU was flirting with that through the second and third quarter. Of course, they figured it out. They're fine. They actually ended up, I would argue, outplaying SMU or sorry, Clemson for a lot of the game. They just weren't able to ultimately get it home. And that's the kind of game where, again, you take it under consideration, you punch them a little bit for it, but like it's not a game changing moment, right? Like it's not a paradigm changing situation for SMU. And so I think that again, it was handled correctly. And like, look, I think it would have been a really bad precedent to set. We've talked about this all week. The idea that you can lose a conference championship game in a power conference and drop 4 spots out, like from being firmly into the college football playoff to firmly out, short of, again, total disaster happening.
I have to say, I mean, and it wouldn't have been possible when I think about Notre Dame's position in all of this, but had Georgia lost the overtime to Texas, there was a small chance they could have ended up as the 5th seed playing Clemson in the first round, which would have been hilarious. Although again, I think at that point, if Georgia had lost, they would have, of course, they would have stayed in. But I think at that point, Notre Dame would have probably kept a little bit higher up, or at the very least, Penn State would have been that coveted 5 seed. But one of the things, I mean, I just have to ask. So these matchups are fascinating, and the fact that the G5 overperformed all expectations going into this season, there was, just for those who may not have been around, particularly for the offseason discussions, there was a concern with all the moves of the previous top G5 programs into the P4 conferences, UCF, Houston, et cetera, and SMU, of course. There was a concern that we would get some of the weaker opponents, and then the BCS years when there was a +1 in the New Year's Bowls, as well as in the 12-team playoff with the access spot. There have been some weak occasional teams that had popped in because of, and arguably last season with Liberty, that we would end up with this season and next season 2 really weak teams that will make when they revisit everything for 2 seasons from now, when they're going to actually potentially tweak the model, we'd lose the G5 spot. But with Boise State not only doing better than expected, but ending up with a 3 seed, the side benefit of that is that 12 seed game doesn't look nearly as bad as some people thought. I mean, I hate to pick on this team, but I always think of like the Western Michigan team that PJ Fleck had. It just went in there and it just got outclassed, or an NIU team that went through. Like,
Hey! I if I remember correctly, I'm having to check the score of that game. I think that Western Michigan had a chance like midway through the third quarter. It wasn't a total disaster. I will give them that. I'm trying to think. Who was it?
Well, really, we should just see the Liberty game last year. We didn't want to see Liberty Oregon.
That's the one.
That's the one no one wanted to see again. But we're not doing that. Like, there's no way people are going to think of Clemson, Texas. That I don't care what they say the line is going out. Like, I am absolutely stoked for that game. And that was the game that everyone feared the most. It was going to be some team in the 20s that just because they needed to add a G5 team was going to get stacked up against the number 5 seed. Now that actually looks like a compelling game. But I wonder, what are your thoughts on these pairings?
Yeah. Well, I will say one more thing on the group of 5 front. So like, look, I think that this is always going to be a little bit more of a threat with the group of 5, because like Liberty went 13-0, right? Like they won every single one of their games, and there wasn't another team that had fewer than 2 losses. I think that's going to be an outlier. I don't think that most years it's going to be like that. Because, for example, last year, if Oregon plays SMU in the Fiesta Bowl, I don't think it looks like that, right? Like, I don't think that it looks that bad. I think that if they play Tulane last year, it certainly doesn't look that bad. So, like, I think that last year was a little bit of an outlier year where there just wasn't an awesome group of five team, but that hasn't been the case usually. Usually there is at least one or two quite good group of five teams. Of course, now the Mountain West is kind of standing up, but look at these matchups and these first round matchups, especially so many interesting storylines because you have the first in-state battle between Notre Dame and Indiana since 1991, and before that they hadn't played since 1958. So these teams don't play, even though they're obviously both playing major college football. And when you look at Indiana's history, it obviously makes a little bit more sense there. So I think that's going to be a tremendous matchup. I think the tickets for that game, like the fight, is going to be fierce. I actually really need to try to get some clarity on how exactly it's going to work, like in terms of like how they'll distribute tickets, because it's home sites, but it will likely be administered as a neutral game, right? Like like the season ticket holders won't necessarily get like first crack at their seats, I would assume. So like this is a crowd for a home game that I think probably will be more like maybe like 60-40 Notre Dame or something like that. Maybe more, who knows? But I think it's going to be a lot of fun to get to see that. I also I mean, you have Texas versus Clemson. It's kind of the old versus the new, but like this is not a matchup that I love if I'm Texas. Because the thing that I always say about especially the elite teams, right, is like there's a level of team that's built a certain way that can't, like, they can create a team that normal teams can't hang against. But there are teams that can beat those teams that normal teams can hang against, if that makes sense. So like Clemson comes into this game with obviously one of the best defensive lines in college football, a really good defense overall. I think that they're going to cause Texas a lot of trouble running the ball. And offensively, like, I mean, again, like Cade Klubnik is a playmaker. Texas had some moments where they've had quarterbacks run against them. I'm curious if that ends up being a big part of the game plan. So, like, look, I think Texas is going to win, but I also think that it's going to feel bad. Like, I think it's going to feel bad. Whereas, again, like, if we're like a couple weeks ago, right, and like, I don't know, like if I mean, even I think that like Iowa State would be a weird matchup against Texas, right? Like I just don't think that that would go very well, just because of a matchup perspective. Well, like that's not what you're getting here. Like you're getting a team that can match up with what you do well, and then again, you have a coach who's won more national championships than a blue blood program since 1970, right? Like this is a good program, and so I think this is going to be a really, really fascinating matchup. SMU at Penn State, that's such a weird one. Like, that's just one of those, like, oh, well, what are y'all doing here? Like, y'all play the same sport, Penn State and SMU. Like, that's just it's a crossover episode kind of matchup there. And then like I feel like, and I might be wrong, I kind of feel like Ohio State is going to destroy Tennessee. Like I kind of feel like they might win by like 3 touchdowns because Tennessee is a team that's really struggled to generate much offensively. Now, the big thing is Tennessee is built. This is a weird. I don't know if this is a fair comparison. They're built not dissimilarly to Michigan, right? Like they have some Michigan to them. The difference is, I think that Ryan Day is not going to get in his head like he does against Michigan of needing to out-tough them. So, like, I think that this is kind of the proxy, like, what the Michigan game should have looked like, where you're just going to see Ohio State go over the top over and over and over again. And
they're not going to aim at James Pierce and say, we're going to push James Pierce out of the way.
Yeah, like, don't do that. Don't do that. Bad idea. Don't do that. Don't do that. But like I think that Ohio State is like, I think they could come out real angry and potentially dominate this game. So I think all of these are good matchups. The lines are really big on all of them. And like I don't know. I feel like these games are going to be closer than we project. Because again, I think that there's this assumption that like, oh, how could SMU hang with Penn State? Penn State just hung with Oregon. Well, like, I don't know. SMU is pretty good. Like, SMU is really dynamic. They can make things happen. And this isn't the level of Penn State secondary from a year or two ago. Like, they're still really good, but I think that you can get behind them a little bit. So I'm excited for these matchups.
Yeah, it is interesting because I wonder how much of it is SMU. I always hate saying it this way, but did they lose at a good time where you got shook up and now you're going to really take your next opponent seriously? Because you knew maybe you didn't think Clemson was the same team as you grew up with, or a few years ago, but they know Penn State and they're probably, I don't know what even their history of playing each other is. That's going to be one where they'll take it seriously. Although, I mean, we're going to get every team's hopefully best shot. There is always the chance that you're going to get a team that gets in their head or just has an off opening, and they're going to be playing. All of these teams are talented enough to run away early, where you'd end up in a situation like SMU did against Clemson, and you're forced to play catch up. Yeah, there isn't a bad matchup here. None of these sound bad. I mean, if you take out whatever team colored lenses you might have, like these are all like Tennessee, Ohio State. I'm excited for that one. I could see Ohio State winning heavily, being in the horseshoe, but at the same time, I am really concerned about where they're at right now after that Michigan game. They're going to have all the reporters asking them, so, like, how did that go? They know it,
Yeah.
and they could come back and just absolutely obliterate. Chip Kelly might be like, Ryan, I love you, man. Let me do my thing.
Let me cook. No, I think I think again, it's just like the thing is too is if Ohio State has an awesome game against Tennessee, like that's a huge story still. Like that's a okay, Ohio State is figuring things out. Like I don't I don't think that there's a lot of bad outcomes in these games because either like you look at Texas against Clemson, you look at Ohio State against Tennessee. If they look awesome in these games, then we go, oh, this is like a title contender. This is a really really good team. I think that probably the one that has the most potential to be juiceless would probably be just like an ugly Penn State win over SMU, where it's just like both teams score below 17 points, and like I think that that's probably the most like yuck potential. But like I kind of I mean I even look at this again this Notre Dame Indiana game. If Indiana gets smothered, like that will be like a ooh okay Notre Dame, all right, you're ready for like I think that like even the bad outcomes of these games I think are still pretty interesting.
3 northern games. The weather is going to be fun to pay attention to before this happens.
That's what's
Because
going
you
to be
just
so
described
much
like
fun.
imagine it's a snowstorm at Penn State. I'm like, that's going to be the final score no matter what, probably.
Well, I mean, listen, we're used to that out here in Dallas, Texas. We're used to the snow and cold. We're used to having a stadium in a place so cold that they're having to spend $1 billion to retrofit it for the cold. That's totally normal to us. By the way, I will say too, look again, I felt like it wasn't a discussion between SMU and Alabama. Like I felt like it was going to be obvious. I didn't have that much trepidation about it. I had heard from one or two people who obviously have sources like in the SEC and stuff like that. Like last year, you got the full court press from the SEC. Like, no, Alabama deserves to be in. Florida State should be out. Like, I think that the SEC this year kind of was like, yeah, we're probably out. Like, I think that they understood earlier than last year that like the case just isn't as good this year as it was last year. But again, I posted some stuff on social media, just kind of expressing my thoughts that I felt like SMU was safe, and I got multiple people be like, your location is Dallas. Oh, you're just an SMU. Like, dude, do you know how much SMU wishes that it worked like that? that it works like you live in Dallas, so you're biased for SMU. Do you know how much how much money they spent trying to make that happen? I don't think that's a thing here, man. Like, I don't think that's what's happening here.
Well, that's the kooky kind of conspiratorial fans are what make this such an interesting sport to cover. One last thought I had on the Clemson versus Texas matchup. These are two teams that were criticized heavily for losing big games against tough opponents all season long. And then both of them went to overtime. Clemson obviously won, or didn't go to overtime, but nearly went to overtime. Clemson won on that 56-yard kick, and then Texas obviously lost in a very close overtime game. So I do wonder how much of it is going to be the team that comes out of that. There's an extra level of, did we really deserve to be here? Texas keeps getting the benefit of the doubt, and that's part of preseason hype, being Texas, not opening and losing so badly to Georgia like Clemson did, and they've kind of had to work their way up since. But I'm very fascinated to see that dynamic too, because those are two teams where I'm still not sure. Of course, they get Arizona State, which is the lowest ranked of the four, although after seeing what they did against Iowa State, I don't know if I want to face Arizona State, especially if they're healed as well. And just watching the way they're, was it Gilroy who stepped up, Xavier Gilroy who stepped up, Guillory, pardon me, for Jordan Tyson. That was phenomenal. Yeah. He had just a phenomenal game, and of course Skedabo and all that stuff. But one last thing I wanted to mention, as kind of the way they were seeded, is the awkwardness of having three Western teams and only two Bulls in the West. And we knew for certain that, of course, the Rose Bowl was going to get any Big Ten champ, which ended up being Oregon, which is already on the West Coast, great, and that the Sugar Bowl was going to get the SEC champ, Georgia, no problem. But then you're stuck with, where do you place the other two teams? Arizona State and Boise State. Arizona State, I genuinely feel bad for them. The Fiesta Bowl is in their backyard, and they got sent to the Peach Bowl for their quarterfinal game because Boise State gets the Fiesta Bowl, which is in a way a spiritual place for any Boise State fan. I remember watching the Oklahoma game that night in January 2000, I think it was 6. This is one of the most phenomenal moments I've ever seen in sports. It's probably 07. Just a phenomenal moment in sports, but it is a hallowed ground for the Bronco faithful. But man, Arizona State, ouch. You got to go all the way over to Atlanta.
Yeah, that's a hilarious one. I mean, the other thing too that's hilarious is, by the way, you know why the Peach Bowl is available? It's because the Georgia Bulldogs can't play in the Peach Bowl, even though it's in Atlanta, Georgia. The way that it's going to work for these next 2 years, for people who don't know, we've talked about it a little bit on the podcast, but in 24 and 25, essentially, we're still in the first college football playoff contract, which lasts 12 years. And so the existing contracts with the Bulls and with bowl tie-ins still apply. So even though Georgia is the number 2 seed in the college football playoff, they don't get to choose to stay home and play in the Peach Bowl. They're required to go to the SEC's contracted game, which is the Sugar Bowl, whether or not they want to. So that'll be done after 2026. I actually asked somebody on the college football playoff staff, like back when they announced how this would work. I'm like, okay, so what you're telling me is, hypothetically, if Cal has the number 1 seed in the college football playoff, they can't choose to play in the Rose Bowl. They'd have to go to the Orange Bowl because they're in the ACC. Like they could be playing Florida and they'd have to go to the Orange Bowl. Like, and they're like, yeah, that's how it's going to work.
Just to clarify, it's only when they're quarterfinals. It doesn't apply to the semifinal games. I only mentioned that because. Good.
So the clarification on that is, oh, actually, no, sorry, you're right. The semifinal then will only get tied based on the geography specifically of the number 1 seed. So for example, Oregon is the number 1 seed. They will, I believe the semis, one is the Cotton Bowl for sure. So they will get put in the Cotton Bowl. Is the other the Orange this year?
That's why the ACC doesn't really apply this year, because Cal would be regional.
I'm just getting mad. Yeah. But so actually I believe that if Cal was the 1 seed for the semis, I think they'd get the Cotton instead of the Orange, because I think that the first round or the quarters are the only ones that apply. So it's confusing. If the big thing is, if you see something and you're like, I don't like that, it's probably not the committee's fault. And it's probably not even the CFP's fault. There's probably like an existing contractual reason that they decided to do it, right? And so, I was just looking at this tweet from Joel Klatt over at Fox Sports, and he was like, what a horrendous job this committee did. The team that was penalized the most was Oregon, and the team that was rewarded was Penn State. I guess the Ducks should have laid down in the 4th. That's just a fundamental misunderstanding of not knowing how the format works, right? Like, that's just not knowing. And again, like, obviously we're going to see, maybe Penn State will have a very favorable path to the college, to the semifinals, or even to the national title game. But they also have to play an additional game. And the other piece of this too, if you're Penn State, is like there was no lock that you were gonna get the 5 or the 6. Like you could have dropped to 7 or 8. Like you might have had to play Ohio State in the first round. And I think that the other piece of this too is like everybody's looking now, especially at the 1-8. But like at the end of the day, the real problem is that Ohio State lost to Michigan. That's the thing that's broken this bracket, is that the best roster in college football completely tripped over itself multiple times. So like there's no system that's going to fix the the best roster in the country playing badly. Like you can't fix that. That's not something that you can anticipate or work around. And so like I do think that there has been at this point quite a bit of, I don't know if anger is the right word, but like a lot of annoyance at the way that the bracket is framed with the 4 champions getting the top 4 seeds. There's been a lot of people I've seen upset about that because they're like, well, how is Boise State the 3 seed and Texas the 5 seed or whatever, right? I mean, one, I think that we just have to see this bracket played through. This was something that we had talked about a year ago. This is not a surprise that people are responding like this. But two, we also have to see how the games go. Like, I don't think that anybody can really watch any team that's played in college football this year and look at the 12 teams that are in this bracket and say, well, this team is clearly going to destroy that team. Like, you just really can't do it this year. The teams are too different. The teams are too good. Again, the 5-12 game between Texas and Clemson might be a bad matchup for Texas. I look at a team like Arizona State right now. Like at one time, the Big 12 champion looked like, oh, well, maybe not an awesome team. Arizona State is rolling right now. And I would not want to be a team that has to deal with all of that has to deal with Cam Scadaboo. And so, like, again, let it play out before we start writing our and thinking up and tweeting about like all of our aggrieved takes about the committee, because again, like, we don't know how this is going to go until it plays out. I need everybody to take a deep breath.
One thing I just want to say, and I don't think the committee aimed at this. They've said they don't care about rematches, but the quarterfinals only have a risk of one rematch, and that is if Ohio State beats Tennessee, we will finally see the Big Ten. We will see a new Big Ten title game. People probably nickname it where they would play Oregon. But the rest of them, looking at these, there's no chance of a quarterfinal rematch. Now, semifinals, we'll see, and all of that stuff. But that's I think something nice. Even then, like what would be the semifinal rematch? This is fantastic. Indiana, Penn State, I think is the only one, but they never played each other.
No,
Like
they
you
never
would,
played. Never played.
yeah. So you would not get one. Yeah, I'm looking at this. Like it would have to be a national championship rematch for two of these to, if fantastic. Yeah, it would be Penn State, Ohio State. Or Penn State, or Indiana, Ohio State. Those are the only feasible. Which Ohio State, Indiana too is the national championship we all expected. Odds are pretty low.
I mean, and look, like it ended up being a little bit of a blessing in disguise that the SEC only got 3 in. Like it
Yeah,
kind of changed the paradigm of the setup because
yeah,
that happened. And so now all of a sudden you have obviously Notre Dame we knew was going to be in. You have 2 ACC teams, but they're 11 and 12, so they're extremely unlikely to play each other. And so like it just really opens things up. And again, I just reiterate, people just need to see this bracket played through before we start freaking out. Like
yeah.
we just have to see the games. Look, if this was a situation where we had 2015 Alabama or something like again, it would kind of break the system, but we don't. We don't have that right now. Every team except for Oregon right now. And look, we might look back and Oregon might just roll through everybody. They might just be the 2023 Michigan. They might just be the 2021 or the 2020 Alabama or whatever, right? So like there's a chance, certainly. But like I think that people like I think it's going to go better than people think. I think it's going to go better than people think.
Absolutely. And then, of course, I should have said the other variety would be a championship conference title rematch, because you could get Oregon, Penn State, you could get Texas, Georgia, and you could get, I think that's it. Yeah, because everyone else only, or no, or you could get, Clemson, SMU. That would be the least likely. That would be the most spectacular of them all in terms of the least likely odds. Well, I think we've had a chance to really, look through this. This was kind of a quick reaction show. We wanted to give it our thoughts as soon as these came out. We want to thank all of you for listening. Thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Please be sure to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can, of course, find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at cbssports.com. Head there and read it at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok and Blue Sky. I'm Bobak Hyeri, part of the group that runs our CFP, the home of college football on Reddit. Thanks for listening.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.